So our first speaker in the next session is Dave FODEN, who's Head of Working Conditions and Industrial Relations in Eurofound.
Just to start, I was brought up in a town called Bolton, so you'd think I'd find my way around Bolton Street fairly easily. Finding my way around the building was not quite so easy, I have to say, and I might not have arrived at all if I hadn't found help. In some respects, I'm going to talk about a slightly different angle on this issue than I think the majority of what will follow. The programme talks about sustainable jobs, and sustainable employment has already been brought up, and that's hugely important for all the reasons which have been outlined already. What I'm going to talk about a little bit more, I would say, is sustainable work, and the difference I'm trying to draw attention to there is the content and design of work, what people are actually doing in their jobs. And that's also an important issue, not least because of the expectation, very controversial expectation, that people will work longer into their lives as fertility declines and as the population ages. People are expected to work beyond 60 and 65 to 67, or perhaps even later than that. And that's not likely to be possible if work, how it's organised and designed, does not take account of the requirements of that ageing population and workforce. So, just to come back to the foundation, which is hiding away in Loughlinstown, we are an EU agency, one of about 40 EU agencies, but we were one of the first ones. Next year we celebrate our 40th birthday, and we were established as part of the European Union's first social action programme. And one of the objectives of the European Union is in the words of the treaty, constant improvement of living and working conditions. And it was decided in the mid-1970s that to support that, a foundation that would produce research, knowledge, would be a useful thing to have. And so we were established with a governing board which includes representatives from every member state, both from government, normally the Ministry of Labour or Social Affairs, but also from employers' organisations and from trade unions, as well as the European Commission. And essentially we generate a lot of research and data on living and working conditions. We do a lot of monitoring of those things, but we also do analysis and exploring what works and case studies, and we try to disseminate those findings to particularly the sort of social actors who are directly engaged in changing working and living conditions, but obviously to others who are interested as well. Now, what I'm going to talk about this morning will draw on one of our largest and longest established activities, which is a survey of working conditions, which has so far been conducted 5 times throughout Europe, most recently in 2010, and that's the material I will draw on. In 2010, we covered 34 countries. Over 43,000 interviews were done. The population we interview are workers, either employees but also self-employed, and it's done face-to-face in people's homes, and it's an interview of about 40 minutes. So it's a pretty substantial piece of research, and just, as it says, we have 25 different languages and 16 language variants to deal with. So organising this is, at least in our terms, a pretty massive project. I think we had over 3,000 interviewers in the field. And we're in the middle of trying to prepare the next one, because we're going into the field again in 2015. For the rest of what I'm going to say, which is talking about technology and working conditions, I think this framework is of some relevance. It's a few years old now. It's drawn from a piece of work we did about 10 years ago, but it's trying to look at what are the different dimensions of people's work and employment and what influences their quality. And I'm not going to go through it in detail now, not least because there isn't time. But what I'd like you to do in looking at this is to think about, well, what's the relevance of technology for these things? And I think some of the points do leap out. Not necessarily for job and employment security as such. Employment status isn't directly linked to the use of technology. But using and acquiring skills, health and safety, what sort of risks are you exposed to? Particularly work-life balance, which I'll say a bit more about later on. I think you can all instinctively see that using or not using technology, using it intensively or not, the ways you use it could have an impact on those elements of people's working lives. So, this slide is not only looking at the 2010 survey, but also going back to 2000. And it's just to, in a way, to position the discussion, looking at the proportions of workers who are using machinery, so the more traditional industrial sort of workplaces, using ICT, using both, or where it's not relevant at all for their jobs. And as I think you would expect, and as is also shown in the next slide, there's a pretty constant looking trend for people to be using more ICT, more information technology at work. A decline in the use of the traditional machinery, decline perhaps of traditional industrial jobs. And when you put the two together, well, it's modestly declining as well. So that's the sort of positioning of where we are. More people are using technology, particularly ICT at work. And on this one, it's indicating the share of workers who are using ICT in 2010. Over at this end, as you probably would expect, we have the Nordics, Netherlands, Luxembourg. Ireland is, I think, yes, slightly above the average on the share of workers using ICT, which again perhaps would not be a big surprise, given the changes in the economy over time. Now, to come in a way more to the heart of the working conditions issues, this slide is a representation of a well-established model in the literature which looks at what's called job strain. A researcher called Karasek developed this. And in a way, it's putting on one axis indicators of work intensity. That's on the, point again, on the bottom axis along here. And on the other one, measures of autonomy. The theory being, and it does seem to work in the research, that strain is a bad thing, though not unconditionally. Autonomy is a good thing. It helps you to cope with the strain. And so you develop these four quadrants. What are called passive jobs, relatively little job intensity, but not very much autonomy either. You're doing something, but you're told how to do it and get on with it, but you're not being given sort of fierce deadlines, or you're not being controlled by the pace of a machine, or demands from an electronic system telling you what to do. Over here is the problematic quadrant, actually, because here you have quite high job demands, but not very much autonomy to help deal with them. Over here, well, we don't find any of our categories in this case. The low strain, where you have quite high autonomy, even though you don't have high job demands. And over here, what are called the active jobs, because having some pressure of time and work intensity often has a positive connotation, has positive implications. People enjoy being given, enjoy a certain amount of pressure in their work, at least many do, provided they have the resources with which to cope and deal with it. And we see here that the ICT and machinery group both fall into that quadrant. The ICT group a bit less strained than the others, in fact. Now, so the rest of what I want to talk about is particular category which we've called e-nomads. And these people are people who are working essentially intensively with information technology, and in a way, in the sort of transformative way that perhaps technology was expected to change our lives and our work. They're the people who aren't just sort of sitting at a desk using a computer. They're also mobile. They're working in different locations. They're working at different times. And so we thought it was interesting to have a look at what these people were doing and what the implications were. There are quite a lot of them, about a quarter of the European workforce in 2010. It'll be interesting to see if there are more in the next wave. And Ireland is very close to the average, just below the average on that measure. Big variations in the incidence per country. Again, the Nordics are where it's most common and well established. And there is, as you would expect, some relationship with the level of economic development. Typically, well, they're more typically male. They're typically well educated. More than half have been to third level education. They're in their middle years, and they're in service sectors, and they're in relatively occupations which are relatively high up the skills ladder. So, what does it mean about the quality of their work for this group? Is technology for this group actually being liberating and transformative in the way that we would have hoped? The indicators along here are taken from a more recent piece of work which we did on the 2010 data set, looking with in the back of our minds those dimensions of job quality which I referred to earlier, but trying to narrow them down very much to what the actual job is about, rather than wider issues in the labour market about security or social protection, but what happens actually in your own job, in your own workplace. And also using indicators, altogether we used about 70 indicators from the survey, where there is an established relationship between, with the well-being and often the health over time of the worker concerned. So we've drawn on a lot of research beyond our own to develop these indicators. And how do the intensive users of technology, the e-nomads, compare on these job quality measures to the rest of the population? They're a bit better paid on average. Their employment prospects are better on average. What we call intrinsic job quality, which includes a whole range of different indicators, some of which are also listed separately there, is better. The content of their work as such is better. Working time quality I'll come back to. A lot more skills and discretion in how they use their skills and how they go about their work than other workers, so that sounds quite desirable. Good social environment, a little bit less positive, and the sorts of things which are behind that measure, I think what the influence we're seeing there is the risk of isolation, that this is a group of workers who are not coming to the same place to work with the same group of people day after day. They're on the road perhaps, or they're working at home. They don't share in the typical patterns and mores that are established in workplaces. So I think that's an important part of what they're missing. But they may be also missing some of the things which can be undesirable in workplaces. They're missing some of the tensions and conflicts and the rest of it. So that might be more positive. Good physical environment, that's to do with exposure to health and safety risks. And work intensity, we talked about a bit more. So, I'm coming towards the end, Chair, as I know I've gone over a little bit more than I should have done. I wanted to draw particular attention, though, to the issue about working time patterns, where they do have some differences to the rest of the population. And think back to the earlier slide, the dimensions of job quality, the one particularly about work-life balance. This group is working longer hours on average. It's working more often on Sundays, in the evenings. They have to adapt and work during their free time more often than others, and adapt their schedules, and their working times increase. So, just to come to a conclusion, they're particularly affected by this blurring of boundaries between work and private life. There is some risk of isolation. In relation to health and safety, because they're not in the same place at the same time as everyone else, they're not easily represented, they can't easily be trained, they may be less familiar with standards, and so on and so forth. So while their jobs are positive and desirable in many respects, there are some risks and some dangers for this group. And I know it's a slightly different way into the topic than what I would expect the bulk of the speakers to talk about, but I think it is useful to think about work as well as employment and as well as jobs. So the data is available on a public data set, and there's other material available on our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David.